Well, welcome to all of you watching this. This is our fourth video now that your Association Stewardship and Caring Committee has put together with Don Hill, a longtime specialist in the field of church fundraising and stewardship. If you didn't get a chance to see the other three videos yet, they're posted on the association website. But Don has been part of our association life now several times. He's working with the Living Waters Association, which I don't think I mentioned before and should have. And he's been part of our conference meetings. And we've engaged him to have some conversations with us on a variety of topics. Members of our committee, Mike Fauner, Fran Brodman, Adrian Sunday, and myself, Dave Plant Chair, are here today. Jay Scott, a fifth member, is out in the field. If you saw our other previous videos, we joked about the fact that while we've rolled these out separately over several weeks, you will notice we're all dressed exactly the same because it's this Saturday in April. And the reason Jay's not here is because he's planting that food which we will harvest and eat in the fall. So today we've identified a topic for each of the videos. The fourth topic that we wanted to look at is the notion that we've given the title, We're Back, Addressing Church Giving After Returning to the Sanctuary. And Mike, I think you have the first question in this go around.
Thank you, Dave. Don, what would you find are the opportunities and challenges that we face in changing how we are gathering?
Well, I think this period of disruption has presented a great opportunity for us that I hope we take advantage of. Rather than just going back to doing what we did before, I hope all of our congregations use this opportunity to look at what has happened over the last 18 months or so and figure out what we want to keep, what's not necessary for us to keep, what are some of the successes that we've seen, what does it mean for us to be the church in this new age. And I think having that conversation will be important for sustaining the giving that we've seen happen over the course of this period. We talked earlier about the word I get on the street is that despite the real worries that pastors and others had about congregational giving being in steep decline because people weren't gathering, that hasn't come true. That people have in fact continued to give to the church. What does that mean? Why is that the case? So all of those questions I think are a real opportunity for us going forward. I think if people are like me, this is an opportunity for the church to innovate and to perhaps look at its life very differently. And I think that provides lots of opportunities for strategic planning and through sort of articulating a compelling vision for going forward, opportunities for people to give.
Okay. Well, when you talk about, we've been through this time of change. Here we're doing a Zoom meeting. And I dare say many of us, unless you work in this kind of an arena in the business world, had very little understanding of this at all. And so technology has made a big difference. And I think Fran had a question, excuse me, that it has come to the forefront during this changing time. And what does it relate to in the time ahead? Although we just lost Fran's picture, I'm not sure what that
where did I go?
I don't know what you did, but why don't you ask your question and then work on getting your picture? There you
Oh,
are.
there.
Fran, what was the question that you were gonna ask?
Should we continue to emphasize electronic giving even after we are back together?
An unequivocal yes to that. The reality is that if, you know, I suspect most people, even older people like me, are at the point where the only checks we write are to the church. Everything else we do electronically. So I think using this moment when people have moved more intentionally towards electronic giving is an important thing to do. The statistics show that people end up giving more when they schedule their giving through electronic giving. So for those congregations that haven't been doing it, I think it's a real opportunity to continue that work. For those who have been doing it to some degree, perhaps even enhancing the way that people, the many ways that people can give electronically. So my answer is an unequivocal yes to that.
I think that fits right into the third question that Adrian was going to share. Go ahead and share it, and then we can talk about it, Adrian.
Sure. Don, should our offering time be different once we're back?
Well, you know, this is one of my bugaboos because I have for a long time believed that in most of our congregations, our time of offering is anemic at best. We sort of stand up and say, God has been good to you, where's the money? Without any sense of celebration or education or wonderment or anything that can go with a collection time. You know, I grew up in the African American church in the South, and during collection time, you got up and you walked to the front of the sanctuary, and you know you offered your gift actively. And I'm not saying everyone has to do that, but I think we have to make it more than just an afterthought, and this is an opportunity to do that. Many churches have been thinking about, especially those churches that do electronic giving, what it means to pass a plate that very few people do anything with. So I think coming back is a real opportunity to think about actually our worship experience as a whole. I wonder what, you know, if there's some conversations among pastors about how worship will be different in general because of this period of time. Will it be shorter? Will it incorporate technological elements even when we are together? All those sorts of things I think are really important questions for us to deal with, including our offering time. Be interesting to have a conversation about why we do an offering time during worship, and get back to the essentials of what that is. Maybe that can be your next book after the book on tithing, Reverend Plant, is, you know, what it means to be a grateful people in liturgy. And we'll have to think of a catchy title for that, but.
There you go.
Yeah.
There are likely better people to write that book than myself. Well, I want to give the others a chance to come back, but what you talked about raised a couple questions for me, but I'm a natural extrovert. So Mike, Fran, Adrian, do you have any response to anything Don said up to this point?
Well, I just, you know, he does bring up some excellent points. That this experience has, you know, sort of forced us to look at things that, especially with technology, that we had sort of been, for lack of a better term, kicking the can down the road. Oh, someday we should look at live streaming, or someday we should look at the technology to enhance worship. The other thing that I thought was very important that he said was that we don't educate and celebrate what the tithes and offerings that come in, what they're doing. You know, a lot of people sometimes will find out, oh, I didn't know, you know, we helped out in that particular disaster. You know, I think it's important to tell people what their offerings are actually doing, other than keeping the lights on and the lawn mowed.
Which,
Right.
by the way, are important things, but
Yeah, right. Yes, we do need to keep the lights on, and we do have to mow the lawn. But yeah,
and even pay the pastor. We should probably.
Well, yes.
For that. Yeah.
I was a little hesitant to say that, but yes, that's.
Dave, you said you had some questions that
Well,
the conversation has raised.
Well, one of the questions I have is that I'm pastoring a church, which I have not raised the question with about should the pastor know what people are giving.
Oh my.
And not for the purpose of going, well, you aren't giving, so therefore you must be a bad person. But it's really a pastoral care issue. And it's an issue of, again, how do we effectively look at the mission of the church and its sustainability in terms of all that means. But I have asked my secretary from time to time to give me some comparative figures. And one of the things simply was, you know, again, trying to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. Recently, I said, well, how many people gave during the first quarter of 2019 as opposed to the first quarter of 2020, now that we're fully into a whole year of this COVID thing? And what we found was that about a third of the congregation who gave in 2019 hadn't given anything yet in the first quarter of 2021. And similarly, about a third of the congregation had increased their giving during the same time, comparison time. And then a third of the congregation was relatively the same kind of thing. So that anxiety that you talked about the church, the meaning of the church, and the electronic giving piece is interesting, because one of the flips is that the people who are giving electronically, when you look at the same comparisons, they're some of those who are giving more now than they did in 2019. In essence, they gave when they came, but it wasn't as consistent as doing it electronically and having that drawdown. So for myself, it was, how might you just engage in those kind of conversations with people? And you know, try to not make it I'm snooping on you, but make it, you know, is this teaching us something about ourselves and about who we are and where we're going and where we need to be going?
Well, I think it shouldn't surprise us that people are skeptical about pastors knowing what they give, because we live in a society where our worth, in large measure, even thinking about that, our worth is dependent on how much money we have and what we do with it. And the church has been a place, to our credit, where that hasn't been the case, at least in theory. So when we say, well, we want to know what you're giving, people's minds automatically, I think, and justifiably go to, oh, well, you're going to make a judgment about who I am and my worth to this congregation, because that's the way the society works. I think we have to create a culture around money in the church that prevents people from believing that that will be the case. And you know, our ignoring money for so long in the church has meant that that base hasn't been there for that culture. So it'll take a while, I think, to convince people that the church is fundamentally different in how we view people's worth and how we view money. So, you know, it's not you, Reverend Plant, is, you know, the decades of, you know, dysfunction around money in our congregational cultures that has created this skepticism and this fear. So that's not to say that we should give up on that. I agree with you that, you know, I had many pastors say to me that, you know, they often know that there's a pastoral issue that needs to be dealt with when people stop paying their pledge, or when, you know, whatever, or an opportunity when people increase their pledges. But this dysfunction around money, I think, is something that will require perhaps another book and another set of videos to talk about, because I think it's not an easy thing. Pastor Sunday, do you find that to be the case?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The thing that I have heard many pastors say, talking about money is the third rail. You step on it and you die. You know, you hear people say, you know, it's my money. It's what I give is my my business. That, but you brought up an excellent point about, and I think that's something that some pastors don't think about, that there is a hesitancy because of society, and because society judges people by their financial situation, and that could be definitely a reason for people to be very hesitant for the pastor to have knowledge of what they're giving.
Don, you mentioned and used the word dysfunction between money and others, and kind of working off Adrian's point too, as far as having the old tithing sermon ringing the death knell. Why is there such a dysfunction there with money and telling them, or working with people to help get the word across? We need your help.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are a couple of things. The first is this whole notion of the church being countercultural and, you know, not following the lead of the society in valuing people based on their material possessions. But the problem is that we haven't articulated a new way of doing that. What we've done is we've said, all right, well, we're just not going to talk about money. So we don't, for example, many churches that I know of, the pastor, we say to the pastor, we'll take care of the money, you do ministry. And so stewardship is not a pastoral issue, a theological issue. It becomes something that we do in order to do ministry rather than being ministry itself. And that's part of the dysfunction, I think, of dealing with money in the church. You know, if money and sex are the things that people are consumed with, and we tell our pastors that they can't talk about either one of them. And so that creates a tension and a problem. The second thing is, I don't think we equip our pastors to talk about money. Many of them come out of seminaries with financial problems of their own. We don't pay them enough. We don't, require competency in stewardship and financial things for ordination for the most part. So we say to them, this is not something that you need to deal with. All those things together, I think, create a culture around money that is not particularly healthy.
And I might jump in, Mike, to also say I think part of that dysfunction is the pastor's dysfunction, in that we're well aware that in most churches, a significant portion of all the giving goes to support us. And so it starts to feel like it's self-serving to get up and to say, we should all be tithers so that we can meet the mission and vision of the church. And that, of course, includes my salary. And so I say that only because there's a lot of subtlety around that, which brings back to a point that, maybe it is, while the pastors need to affirm the message, whatever that message is of stewardship, perhaps we're not the best persons to do it. And that would come back to a question I was going to ask Mike, you and Fran, as persons in the pew. How do you see that whole business of maybe a pastor knowing what you're giving, or the ways in which stewardship is defined and presented and carried out in the worship service? What's your viewpoint of that? I think sometimes as clergy we get in a room together and become in our own little echo chamber, and we forget to ask persons like yourselves. You're the one sitting there listening to this.
That never happens, David.
What is what is it that you see about that? I'd love your thoughts on those couple of things we've talked about before we end our time together.
Fran?
I don't think Brad ever talks about giving that much, and I don't know if he is involved in seeing how much we give, but I think we all just give what we can give, and I don't think he really cares how much we give, just so that we're there to help him and support him.
I would think too also that knowing what an individual gives is more, I think, relationship between himself and God.
Yeah.
Looking at it from a standpoint, from a business perspective of knowing the demographic and being able to do some analysis of where, what particular age group the money is coming from, whereas an age group maybe we can identify we need some help and tailor a solution based on that. That's important. From an individual perspective, to be honest with you, I think that would be opening up Pandora's box in many cases, because I don't think the people would really, and I think we said it before, that they're looking at it from the standpoint, well, okay, now if you know what I'm giving, you're going to come after me for something. And I don't think it'd be a good thing, because I don't think the people could handle it. Or it'd be a very, very small portion of them that could actually sustain that, if that would come to fruition that way.
Okay.
But at the same time, at least some of these same people, when they go to the symphony, don't mind having their name in the program with the levels that they're giving. And so I often wonder why that's the case. And again, it has to do with the different culture of the church. I think you're right that we don't want to do that. But I remember growing up, Blanche Gallimore, who was a woman in our congregation who was relatively wealthy. I was a little boy. she would give this big gift on Women's Day, and we'd all celebrate it. Now, because of what it did, and because it indicated her generosity, and we were happy about that, and everyone knew it. Now, my mother at Women's Day couldn't come close to what Blanche Gallimore did, but we found a way of not devaluing my mother because she couldn't give that amount of money. And I hope we can create cultures like that in the church, that, you know, we can celebrate generosity by the people who have it, and perhaps celebrate generosity by people who are tithers, who go beyond, who might not have a lot of money, but, you know, there are ways that we can do it. But I think ignoring it is not the way to create that culture that we want.
I think that based upon what you're saying, then, is the point maybe we need to look at and review is, why is that resistance there? And I know in situations we've had before, we have declined, you know, naming a pew for somebody because of putting that person on a quote unquote pedestal. Mm-hmm. Decline naming a window for this particular person, for again putting them on the pedestal. When people have the spotlight, specifically, and we're talking about, you made the example of symphony. I'm quite, you know, apprised of symphonic work and symphonic people, and they love to have their name rolled out there because it raises their stature, and they can sit back and go, "Home." Okay. If we do the same thing in the church, and the church responds the same way,
right?
And we lost Don. There, he's coming back now.
Well, I think, you know, my camera battery has, so we'll just pretend I'm there.
Okay.
As long as you can still hear me. So,
oh yeah,
yeah.
I can still hear you. But it's the, do we want to put people in that position where their ego gets beyond where it should be?
Well, I think the question though is it ego or is it legacy? And how can we find ways of meeting people's need for legacy, while at the same time sticking to our guns, if you will, around our view of money and how it values people or devalues people. Franklinton Center at Briggs, people remember Franklinton Center used to be a part of the United Church of Christ. It's a place down in North Carolina that is a place that people go for spiritual renewal and training and all that sort of stuff. And during the capital campaign there, this whole question of naming things came up because we built a new facility and we wanted to raise money for each one of the sleeping rooms. And this question came up, and we decided that, yes, we would name things, but if Don Hill gave that $10,000 for that room, Don had to choose someone like a Von Delk or someone like that, and the room would be named after a Von Delk, a saint of the church, and I would be recognized as the person who gave the money to recognize that ministry. And that was our way of compromising. They are not even compromising, but of using financial resources to not only highlight generosity, but also promote the legacy of someone important to the life of the church. So I think there are ways of doing it. The reality is we do live in a capitalist society. We do live in a society where money matters. We do live in a society at the same time where people want to be recognized not just for their money, but for the other ways that they contribute to the life of the church. And so it's, you know, again, the book on legacy, Mike, you and I will write, I guess, and
okay.
figure out ways that we can do this. It's not an easy question, but it's one that we need to face, I think. And with our eyes open, and with an understanding of where people are coming from when they want appropriate recognition for their efforts on behalf of God's mission.
Agreed. And I think the key word there is the appropriate recognition.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Well, again, I think this is, this conversation is like many. What it suggests to us is that there's many, many layers to each of the conversations we have. And perhaps sometimes in church life, we cut those conversations off real quickly because of our own perceptions or our own individual response to that. And our initial response may be yes or maybe no. But what it requires is, that phrase that we often have heard, doing a deep dive into it and its various values that it might bring. And I'm always reminded of that line from The Music Man, the other salesman who was very upset. And he said, he's not a good salesman because he doesn't know his territory. And the reality is each of us, hating to describe the church in that way, has a territory that is both specific and at the same time universal. So I think we're going to need to cut this video at this point so that we give Don an opportunity to change the battery in his recorder, if that's possible. But we want to thank Don for being with us today. We have one more video, a fifth video that we're going to produce. And our hope is that if you'd like more information about any of this or would like to respond to this, please use the appropriate space on the association website to share comments or thoughts. And if you'd like to be part of a future pilot program or have more direct interactions with Don, to have him come in and consult with your church, we'll be glad to give you that contact information as well. We hope that this video has been helpful in your congregation's current time of life and in your task as a pastor or a lay person who is listening to this, to give you some thoughtful suggestions about how to proceed. So as I've joked before in the last couple videos now, as we become a little more relaxed in this format, we're going to give you the 3-second stare and pause and smile as Don pauses the recording. Our heads or scratch our beards or take our sip of coffee.
Change our batteries, whatever it might be.
Check your batteries.
Adrian, you said the magic word coffee.
Check your phone, make sure my text that okay, that's good. And, with all the things that are happening in the world, I've got a new associate pastor student. Well, he's now been approved for ordination, and we're going to bring him on board for 1/4 time, which isn't a lot. That we need to, because of all the happenings of this week, we were going to talk about that wonderful topic of the unity of God, the Trinity. And the question is, what's that got to do with people shooting and killing each other all the time in our country?
Wow.
That'd be interesting.
Well, it is going to be, because I think he will have an answer that he and I can agree with, because I think the answer rests in our being able to trust in God, that we can address these things and overcome them, because Christ himself came to us. But at any rate, you don't need tomorrow's sermon, but we have to do some rethinking about that. So
We'll watch it online.
there you go. We'll do our best 3-second pause, and then I'll begin with the introduction for the 5th video. Before I do, is there anything this last video that any of you have thoughts about? You know, I think we've had lots of good interaction. And so, but is there any last thing you have that's burning in you that we want to make sure we bring up?
Well, just I guess to double check, on my printout, I don't have a question, and that's perfectly fine. I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss something, and you go, and Adrian, and what is your question? And I'm standing here going,
Yeah, we only had 2 under that, and maybe
yeah, that's fine.
Yeah,
That's fine. I just didn't want to get blindsided, and you know.
Yeah.
I'm, as you can tell, I'm not quick on the uptake, and I blame that with I say it's been that way since I went through chemotherapy. They talk about chemo brain, but it's probably that I'm just getting old.
We can identify, or I can identify with that. I won't speak for the rest of you, but
I can.
Well, you know, my thing is that's why I married the person I did to make up for my deficiencies, which are leaving. So you know, I may be too quick, and then she's well. Now that I've had a chance to think about it, I mean, so that's why the gift of the gathered community is so important.
that's right.
So let's go ahead and do our best 3-second pause, and then we'll begin to record. I want to welcome you all to this 5th video put on by your Northwest Ohio Association Stewardship and Caring Committee. If you've had a chance to see the previous 4, then I know some of what I'm going to say is repetitive. If you haven't seen the previous 4, this is our committee's desire to bring before you Don Hill. Don has been in the field of church fundraising and stewardship for years. You've seen him if you've been to some of our association annual gatherings or at the conference annual gatherings. You may also remember him from time spent in the national offices and his work now with Living Water Association. The last couple of years, we've been trying to initiate a pilot program where we could have Don work with some congregations willing to take him up on the offer to have him come in and be a consultant coach with their church. It was originally designed as a fee-based kind of structure, but it was also designed with lots of benefits. And the idea was to help with local church stewardship giving. And stewardship in its broadest frame, which is leading us to the topic of this 5th video. Mike Fauner and Fran Boardman and Adrian Sunday and myself, as chair of the committee, are here to have the interaction with Don and Jay Scott, who's another member of the committee, who I think I failed to mention in the previous ones. He came up with the title. He took the generic information and came up with these cute little marketing, if you will, titles for us to pique people's information. And of course, there's a lot of depth behind them, which is the purpose of our videos. So our 5th and final topic in this series, and if you leave comments and you like them, we may figure out how to do more of them, or perhaps some regular Zoom sessions with Don. We just aren't sure, but we hope these are of value. So the topic for this session is plan. Who needs a plan? Setting the tone for your congregation's giving. Fran has been assigned to ask the first question. And so, Fran, go ahead and share the first question we had come up with.
Okay. Giving is about our relationship with and gratitude to God. If we preach and teach that, why do we need a plan for beyond that?
It is a question that comes up a lot. Let me go back to my own experience. I started out in fundraising in secular organizations, and so that has been my background. And what I brought to the conversation once I joined faith-based organizations, first as Director of Development at Andover Newton Theological School, was that background. You know, how do you raise money? And since that time, you know, I've engaged in the battle, it seems, in the church around the stewardship folks and the fundraising folks. And it's a battle that even after all these years continues. And the battle lines are the question that you just asked, you know, what giving has to be for people of faith, for people of Christian faith, a response to God's generosity, and that is enough. And the existence of the church is enough, or should be enough, to impel people to give. And if they don't, once we explain that to them, then there's something wrong with them, or there's something wrong with our preaching and our teaching. And the fundraising folks, on the other hand, say, you know, what we need to do is follow the best practices of engaging people around vision and impact, and that will raise money for the church. And the church needs to articulate a case beyond its own existence and beyond that theological context in order to be successful in raising money. Well, my hope is that we can get to the point where we understand that it's not either or, it's both and. That yes, we as people of faith respond to God's generosity with our own generosity, and that's a necessary, but it's not a sufficient way of looking at the task of generating dollars for the church. The reality is, in previous generations, and certainly in the early church, the church was the principal, if not the only means that God's mission on earth was being realized. And for many people in our congregations today, people who didn't grow up with a traditional understanding of the church, there are many other organizations and ways that people can be generous to and with that meet that goal of responding to God's generosity. So people will say to you, you know, when I give to Habitat for Humanity, I'm responding to God's generosity by supporting an organization that is meeting one of the gospel imperatives. And you know, that can be hard to argue against. I've always said, though, that if you believe what we believe about the church, the case for the church will always be stronger than the case for non-church entities in terms of that support of God's mission. So how do we distinguish? And I think the way we distinguish is by starting with that understanding of generosity, but then putting on top of it, if you will, the best practices in engaging people around why the church is uniquely qualified to realize God's mission on earth. And that, as we talked about in a previous conversation here, is about articulating the gospel values in a way that is accessible to people and understandable for people. Those of you who were around for the Still Speaking initiative years ago, remember that part of the success of that was not creating a set of values that the United Church of Christ was about, but it was about articulating them in a way that was accessible to people. So that's number one. Number two is vision. I think, and I believe many people in our churches believe, especially in the United Church of Christ, that we are called not only to be generous, but to be disciples, to get stuff done, to consider the gospel imperatives and act on them. And so articulating a vision for the church that defines success for people is a way of encouraging and impelling them to give. And then a strategy for achieving that, telling the stories of transformation, is all part of that process of going beyond, I believe, just preaching and teaching generosity to a point where we also engage people in investing, if you will, in the work of the church, with the expectation of ministry outcomes that are outlined for us in the texts of our faith. So that would be my answer to that question. It's sort of a long involvement, perhaps, but it has to be an understanding of generosity, but it can't just be that. Both from a missional perspective, in terms of how we respond to God's generosity, not just with sort of blind, here's some money, but also with an understanding that we're called to effectiveness as well as generosity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mike, I think you had the next follow-up question.
Yeah. Well, in order to bring all these ideas to fruition, who would be responsible? Who do you feel would be responsible for putting together a plan for congregational giving?
Well, one of the things that I think is a missed opportunity is those congregations who create a stewardship committee and say, all right, go off and raise the money that we need in order to do ministry. I think, first of all, there needs to be an integration between the ministry of the church and steward, or let me put it a different way. I think stewardship needs to be understood as a ministry of the church, both to its members and beyond its membership. And that has implications for who provides leadership. Number one, I think our pastors need to be involved as preachers and teachers, and also as people who engage members of the congregation in their giving. We hit upon in our last video what could be a year-long discussion of how pastors are or are not involved in fundraising for congregations. But at the very least, our pastors need to provide leadership in a theological understanding of generosity and discipleship and the connections between the two. In addition to that, if stewardship is not integrated into the leadership structure of the church in terms of council or whatever you call it, I think there's a missed opportunity and the potential for some real problems. The culture around money of the church is often dysfunctional because it's isolated as not being the purview of missional leadership in the church. And I think that's a real mistake. So the direct answer to your question is, all of the leadership of the church has to be concerned about and engaged in the generosity and giving life of the congregation. Otherwise, number one, you're not going to raise the money that you might. And number two, I think our faithfulness in the call to stewardship is compromised.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So, Don, what do you think about, I've heard about some practical strategies. There was a book written way back, Make Meetings Matter. And then another one came out 15, 20 years later, the context of meetings as worship, trying to redefine that work that we often see as the business of the church.
Mm-hmm.
to say no when we're gathered together for a meeting of church council or consistory. That should be an act of worship. Have you seen any creative ways where that kind of thing is expressed in the same way of the act of stewardship? We talked in an earlier video about stewardship, the time, talent, treasure, the wholeness of generosity. Again, are there any ways that you've seen that are just creative that might put in people's minds, here's the thought by how you might do that, and not just have the talking head pastor do it, or the talking head pastor who's afraid to do it. Just how. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. If do you have a couple of juicy tidbits of here's a cute little creative way I've seen, and just think about it. It may be right for those who are listening. It may not be, but it might get them to think of a little different way to.
Well, I'm not sure if this answers your question or not, but your question provoked in me thinking about how, when I work with congregations around strategic planning, I make the distinction and encourage them to make the distinction between the missional components of their congregation, of their conversation, and the organizational components of their conversation. There is, for example, let's take evangelism as an example. There's a missional component of bringing people to relationship with Jesus Christ through their engagement with our faith communities. And then there's the organizational component of saying, we need more pledging units in order to be sustainable. Now, both of those are conversations that happen, but both conversations are compromised unless you, in the conversation, make the distinction about what you're talking about. Because to confuse the two, I think, is a mistake. And I think the same thing is true of stewardship. There's a point at which we in the church need to preach and teach stewardship, no matter what the object of that generosity is. When I was on national staff, people would often say to me, a lot of secular organizations love the United Church of Christ because it's full of generous people. They just don't give to the United Church of Christ. We've been teaching and preaching generosity and stewardship for many years very effectively, but we haven't been doing the fundraising piece. So again, that missional component and that organizational component, we need to be clear about what we're doing and why we're doing particular things and where those things mesh and where they don't. Is that an answer to your question, or did I just go off on another one of my rants that have no bearing on what we're talking about?
I mean, yeah, it's an answer to the question. There's always, as someone who has spent their lives going to thousands of conferences, there's the macro issue and then there's the micro. How do I do this? And are there any, for instance, I think it's good to have someone sitting in a meeting you're going to be the theologian tonight that always asks the question, how is what we're doing? What's that got to do with God?
That's right.
And in the same way, maybe you'd always ask the same question, what is how we're doing got to do with our mission and our raising dollars for its support? And sometimes we just gloss over all those things so quickly into doing the business.
That's right.
But at the same time, if we haven't done a good job, which we talked about in a previous video, because there's a dysfunction out there, a disconnect that has really caused so many churches to get away from the whole conversation due to uncomfortableness. Again, are there any basics to just begin the process anew that would be really helpful, that might be part of that plan, and putting together a plan that could be helpful for people to have a take home with?
Well, I think in goal setting, people need to be aware of and transparent around these two different approaches that the church needs to have in order to be faithful and also to be sustainable. So that when that stewardship committee meets, don't just, there are people on the stewardship committee who are going to be outraged if you only talk about pledging units, and there are people on the committee who will be outraged if you only talk about generosity. So talk about them both. Set goals for both of them, and work towards both of them, and figure out how to make them work with each other, I guess is my encouragement. Transparency of thinking about money is really important, I think. For a long time, we talked about stewardship when what we meant was fundraising. And it was a way of masking something that we thought was unpleasant. I would just encourage us to be honest about what we're talking about. We are, in fact, talking about, getting people to give us more money. It's not just about getting people to be more generous. That's hiding what our real motivation is. So I don't know if that's helpful. I don't know if that's practical enough, but I think that's an important step for us.
Well, thank you for the time. I forgot to explain at the beginning of this video that you've all noticed we're all dressed the same. And that's because we put these 5 videos together on a Saturday morning. And you're seeing the final edited product of it. But the point is that we wanted to raise some thoughtful discussion. It's not meant to be the end of all discussions, but rather hopefully beginning points. And we're hoping that as a committee, we can continue to work with Don in a variety of ways, and perhaps follow through on that pilot program that we talked about with some churches who may want more direct contact with him in the work of being a faithful disciple of Christ, and the work of around the whole conversation of being a good steward of the resources God has granted to us, and as a church as we attempt to engage in those. So please give us your feedback, and send comments through the association website, which provides the resource email for you to use. And we hope to be in further engagement with you, whether it's on Zoom or in person, as the whole pandemic works its way forward. And we're glad to have been able to invite you into our various homes and into Don's presence. I know Don always likes to do a final sharing. So before we close off, Don, do you have a final word of greeting and wisdom for us?
Well, I just want to say I love these conversations, and I love being in conversations with people who are working very hard on behalf of our United Church of Christ. This has been a pleasure, and I will do it 1,000 times more. I think there are some other people who are part of the conversation. I think it's also valuable for you to see your committee in action. It is a group of people who care deeply about your association, about the churches in it, and about the whole United Church of Christ. And I'm grateful to them for their commitment to our community and to stewardship and generosity. So thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this.
Well, thank you. And my understanding to the rest of the committee is we have 2 new people who will be joining us after the annual meeting. So we're actually growing with folks who have said they would like to be part of this endeavor. So with that in mind, be blessed and be a blessing. And again, please email us or pick up the phone, and we'll do our best to get a response to you all. Have a great day today.